Welcome to The Explainer. So, how does a government launch a military strike and then, literally within 24 hours, tell two completely different stories about why they did it? Well, today we're going to try and untangle the very confusing, very controversial U.S. intervention in Venezuela.
And this quote from historian Kevin Cruz, it just nails the absolute weirdness of what went down on the Sunday talk shows on January 4th, 2026. You had the White House trying to sell one story, but it kind of seemed like they had multiple conflicting versions of it ready to go.
Okay, so the real fireworks started when Secretary of State Marco Rubio was sent out to, do some damage control. The only problem? His explanation wasn't just a little different from the president's. It was basically the exact opposite. I mean, look at this. On one side, you have Secretary Rubio talking very carefully about a strategy of economic pressure, seizing oil tankers, that sort of thing. But just one day earlier, President Trump had announced something way, way bigger, that his team, including Rubio, would literally be running Venezuela. It was just a wild public contradiction.
So how in the world did we get here? To really get a handle on this political mess, we've got to rewind and look at the military operation that kicked the whole thing off.
And this whole thing happened at lightning speed. I mean, check this out. Saturday morning, U.S. forces land. By that afternoon, President Maduro is already out of power. And by evening, President Trump is up on a stage declaring a whole new reality. The U.S. is now in control of Venezuela and its oil. It all went down in less than a day. But this wasn't some clean, sterile operation. It came at a real human cost. By Sunday, reports were confirming that 80 people, and that includes civilians, had been killed. And that brings us right back to the core of the problem. You've got boots on the ground, the death toll is climbing, and the administration is telling two totally different stories about what its goals are in Venezuela.
So what's the real story here? Was it the official State Department line that this was just a law enforcement action to arrest Maduro, which, is a pretty clever argument if you're trying to bypass Congress? Or was it what the president himself said, a full-on regime change, complete with nation-building and seizing the country's oil?
Well, no surprise here, Venezuela's new leadership under former Vice President Delcy Rodriguez immediately shot back, basically declaring their sovereignty. President Trump's response to that, a pretty blunt threat, warning her that if she didn't play ball, she would pay a very big price.
Now, beyond all the international drama, a huge political fight was blowing up back in Washington over a really simple question. Who knew this was happening, and why were some very important people left completely in the dark?
So, there's this thing called the Gang of Eight. It's not a movie title, it's actually a really important group. By law, the White House is required to brief these specific bipartisan leaders in Congress about sensitive military stuff like this. The whole point is to make sure there's at least some congressional oversight on the country's biggest secrets. But here's the thing. That protocol was just ignored. Democratic members of the Gang of Eight, like Representative Jim Himes, said they were totally shut out. His statement really points to a fundamental breakdown of the whole process. He's basically saying a legal duty was treated like a partisan choice.
And it gets even more serious. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, who's also in the Gang of Eight, claimed it wasn't just that they weren't told. He said that in 3 different classified briefings, the administration actively misled Congress, telling them that no military action was being planned for Venezuela.
So what's the big picture thinking behind all this? Well, some people are starting to frame this whole aggressive new approach as part of a new foreign policy vision. They're calling it the Donro doctrine.
And critics, like the political analyst Simon Rosenberg, see this new doctrine as a totally radical and frankly damaging retreat. The argument is that by focusing so hard on just dominating the Western Hemisphere, the U.S. is actually choosing to shrink its own global influence. It's turning from a superpower into just a regional one.
And here's where it gets really interesting. This whole idea seems to completely clash with what the American public thinks. A poll taken right before the invasion showed a huge majority, 60%, were against sending troops to Venezuela. Only about a third of the country thought it was a good idea. And this number right here, 75%. This really shows you the disconnect. 3/4 of Americans, and that includes most Republicans, believe the president has to get approval from Congress before taking military action. It's a clear public demand for the exact kind of oversight that was ignored here. For a lot of people watching this all unfold, the administration's early victory celebration is bringing back some pretty uncomfortable memories. It feels like we've seen this movie before.
Congressman Jim Himes, he has a name for this. He calls it the euphoria period.
You know, that initial high you get from a successful military strike when the bad guy is gone and it feels like anything is possible. But as he's warning, America has felt this euphoria before and it almost never lasts.
And he's talking specifically about the early days after the interventions in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya. In every single one of those cases, what looked like an early successful military win eventually gave way to years, sometimes decades, of instability. It turns out, breaking a country is a whole lot easier than running one.
Other lawmakers were even more blunt. For them, this isn't about strategy or what happened in the past, it's about the law, plain and simple. Without Congress signing off, they argue this military action is just flat out illegal.
So here's the bottom line. The military operation might be over, but the really tough challenges are just getting started. The administration is now facing fights at home over its authority. It's facing a global community that's questioning its motives. And it's facing the unbelievable task of trying to run a nation it just broke apart. That initial euphoria, it might not last very long, which leaves us all with one big question. Is history about to repeat itself in Venezuela?